My family had a rule about women: silence. We believed that a woman's voice was poison. When a girl turned 16, a midnight ceremony of silence was held. No, it wasn't literal, but you wore a red thread on your wrist as a constant reminder. If you broke the rule once, you were locked up without food. Twice, you had a tooth pulled. No one dared break it 3 times. Female silence was a kind of currency. The man with the quietest house was the most praised in society. At family gatherings, my uncles would compete like kids, showing off their baseball cards. "Mira hasn't made a sound since January," Uncle Dev would boast. Uncle Rush, with a smug smile, would reply, "That's nothing. Brilla's been doing this for 2 years. When the doctor asked her a question in her checkup, she just pointed at me to answer." It sounds unbelievable, but for a long time, that's how things were. And I, ironically enough, was the loudest person I knew. I had trouble holding a conversation without laughing. I loved to sing at the top of my lungs and make strange noises with my friends. I knew that if I didn't find a solution soon, my life would be over. And one day, the solution appeared. I was in 7th grade when Mr. Brown told us we needed to learn a foreign language. My ears perked up because American Sign Language, ASL, counted. You see, my family and I were in the United States because it was only when you turned 16 and took a vow of silence that you were sent back to our homeland, where you were forced to settle down and have children. So 3 times a week, I sat in Miss Brown's class, learning to speak with my hands. The adrenaline was pumping. If she sent my parents even one text about my language choice, they'd realize what I was up to, and my life would be over. I didn't even know what I was going to do about the lessons, because no one around me spoke that language. But then, Diwali dinner arrived. All our relatives flew in from their homeland to have dinner at our house. It was supposed to be the happiest time of the year, but during lunch, I noticed Prilla sitting alone at the end of the table. Tears were silently streaming down her face, and I couldn't tell why. She was 17. I had been silent for a year. When no one was looking, I handed her a glass of water with a note in my hand. "Meet me by the garden shed. Bring your sister." I told everyone I noticed Suzari was wrinkled, and that I was going to show her how to fold it properly in the shed. That's how it all started. At every family gathering, while the men watched cricket and the hushed women served the food, the younger girls and I would huddle together, desperate to avoid our fate. I taught them the letters first, then the words, and then we'd have whole conversations flowing between our fingers. We got creative with practice locations, signing while washing dishes, our hands hidden in the soapy water. We developed our own secret gestures. A flick of the wrist meant he's coming. A flick of the thumb meant save this conversation for later. By the time I turned 15, we had a whole network. 12 girls between the ages of 9 and 15, all fluent in a language our parents and siblings couldn't understand. The older women noticed, but said nothing. Others began to learn by observing us. Everything fell apart at my cousin Angeli's wedding. She was 15 years old and was marrying a 65-year-old man who had chosen her specifically for her well-trained silence. We were halfway through the ceremony when I noticed his 11-year-old sister staring at me. When I looked at her hands, she gestured. "He hits her." She showed me the bruises. I saw Angeli standing there in her red wedding sari, unable to oppose her own marriage. Something inside me broke. As he began the final vows, I stood up and spoke, but this time it wasn't in sign language. It was out loud. "She doesn't want this marriage. He's been hurting her." My mother's face went white as a ghost. There were gasps all around me. The room erupted, 200 guests watching as I broke the cardinal rule. My father grabbed my arm, hissing about the shame and the consequences, but froze in his tracks as 6 other girls stood up, some speaking for the first time in years. "We know about the beatings," one exclaimed. "This is illegal!" Another one shouted. That's when I heard sirens outside. Through the window, I saw 2 police cars and a Child Protective Services (CPS) van. Someone had called them about an upcoming wedding. I never found out who. The police came in and started asking questions. They separated Angeli from the others, taking her to a quiet corner. The boyfriend tried to slip out the back door, but an officer stopped him. My father kept squeezing my arm tighter, leaving marks that would later turn purple. The other men were yelling at their daughters who had spoken out, their faces red with anger. The CPS workers took Angeli to another room. I could see through the door as they examined her arms. She was crying and nodding, finally able to tell her truth. One of the workers was taking pictures of the bruises. The police began writing down names and asking for IDs, their presence making the air feel electric with tension. My Uncle Deb pushed his way through the crowd and grabbed his daughter by the hair. She screamed, and a police officer immediately intervened, separating them. That made everything worse. That got worse. Now they were watching us all more closely. The men couldn't discipline their daughters with the authorities there, and their frustration was palpable. The lead officer announced they were shutting down the wedding. He mentioned something about investigating reports of abuse and child marriage. The groom, seeing that the police were now preoccupied with the escalating chaos of families arguing and officers trying to maintain order, slipped away during the commotion. No one tried to stop him this time. My father dragged me toward the car. His grip never loosened. She said nothing, but I could feel her anger radiating in waves. My mother followed us, clutching her prayer beads so tightly her knuckles were white. She hadn't looked at me once since I spoke. The other families were leaving too, dragging their daughters along. The parking lot was a chaotic jumble of slamming doors and revving engines. In the car, my father's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He said I had ruined our family's reputation, that we could never show our faces again. He said other men would never respect him again. My mother just kept praying in a low voice, the Sanskrit words barely audible. I looked out the window and tried not to cry, watching the city lights blur. At home, he took me straight to my room. He took my phone and laptop, putting them in his pockets. He said I'd stay there until he figured out what to do with me. The door locked from the outside with a final click. I heard him storm downstairs and start making calls. His voice echoed through the floor. Through the ventilation grate, I could hear him talking to my uncles. He was warning them about the police, asking questions. She told them to keep their daughters out of school for a few days until things calmed down. She mentioned something about an emergency family meeting at Grandpa's house. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't stop thinking about Angeli. I wondered where they had taken her, if she was safe now. I hoped she was safe. I thought about the other girls who had spoken out. Her parents were probably doing the same thing as mine, locking them away like dangerous secrets. Around midnight, I heard a soft knock. My Aunt Mira slipped inside with a plate of food, rice, and dal still warm. She was one of the silenced women, but she gently touched my face. She pointed to the food and then to her heart. I understood. She was proud of me, even though she could never say so. She took out her phone and showed me messages. My cousins were texting each other in a group chat I knew nothing about. They thanked me for speaking up, but they were also afraid. Some of them were already locked in their rooms. Their parents were furious, threatening to send them home early. My aunt left as quietly as she had arrived. I ate my food and tried to think clearly. I knew this was just the beginning. The men would regroup and devise a plan. They always did this when their authority was challenged. They would find a way to reassert control. The next morning, my father opened my door at dawn. He told me to dress in my best t-shirt, the blue one with gold embroidery. We were going to my grandfather's house. All the men would be there for the council. I knew this was bad. My grandfather started the tradition of silence in our family 3 generations ago. The journey took 2 hours along winding country roads. My father didn't speak the entire time. My mother came too, but she sat in the back, still clutching those prayer beads. I watched as the city turned into countryside, the buildings giving way to fields and woods. My grandfather lived in a large house, far from everyone, isolated and imposing. When we arrived, I counted 20 cars in the driveway. All my uncles were there. Some cousins I hadn't seen in years had driven overnight to attend. Only the men, however. They were gathered in the main hall, seated in a circle on cushions. My grandfather sat in his chair like a king, presiding over the court. They made me stand in the middle of the circle. My grandfather asked me to explain. I told him about Angeli's bruises, keeping my voice steady. I said the marriage was wrong, that she was just a child. He laughed and said I was too young to understand our customs, that I had been corrupted by American ideas. The interrogation lasted for hours. They asked who taught me to be so disrespectful. They wanted the names of every girl who knew sign language. I kept saying I only spoke about Angeli, nothing more. My Uncle Raj stood up and said I was lying, that I had poisoned the minds of all his daughters. His face was red with anger, the veins bulging at his temples, as he paced back and forth like a caged animal. The room felt stifling. My grandfather sat at the head of the long wooden table, his fingers interlaced in front of him. The other men, my father, my uncles, several male cousins old enough to have a say in family matters, formed a semicircle around me. The overhead light cast harsh shadows on their faces, making them look like strangers rather than family. Then they started bringing in my cousins, one by one. First was Prilla, my younger sister, Kavya, who was only 12 years old. She was trembling like a leaf. Her small body was lost in a salwar camise that was too big for her. Her eyes, normally full of life, were now wide with terror. My grandfather asked her if she knew sign language. She looked at me. Then she lowered her gaze to the floor, her lips trembling. Her father slapped her on the back of the neck and ordered her to answer. The sound echoed in the room. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I wished I could hug her and tell her everything would be all right, but I couldn't move from my chair. They brought in 8 more girls. Some immediately admitted to having learned from him. Their voices were barely a whisper. Others tried to deny it until their parents threatened them with consequences. I didn't want to imagine Maya, who was 14, resisting as long as possible, insisting she knew nothing, until her father grabbed her wrist so hard she screamed. The youngest was Asha, just 9 years old. She didn't even understand why she was in trouble. She just cried for her mother, who wasn't allowed in the room. Her small voice called for Mom again and again, until her father told her to be quiet. My grandfather declared that this was an infection that needed to be removed. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind that had ruled our family for decades. He said that all the girls who learned sign language would submit to the silent ceremony immediately. It didn't matter that some were years away from turning 16. He said, desperate times call for desperate measures. The other men nodded, some enthusiastically, others with what seemed like reluctance. They didn't dare express their opinion. They separated us into different rooms. I was taken to the basement, a cold concrete space with a small window near the ceiling that let in just enough light to remind me that the outside world still existed. The walls were unpainted cement blocks that seemed to absorb any heat. There was a thin mattress on the floor that smelled damp and a bucket in the corner that I didn't want to think about. My grandfather said I would stay there until I learned proper respect. The door was thick wood, with a heavy lock that clicked purposefully as he left. The first night was the worst. The concrete floor radiated cold through the thin mattress. I could hear the house settling on top of me, creaking and groaning as if it were digesting what had happened. Every sound made me jump. Footsteps, muffled voices, doors opening and closing. I wrapped myself in the only rough blanket they had left and tried not to think about spiders or mice, or how long they planned to keep me there. For 3 days, they kept me down there. Twice a day, someone brought rice and water. The rice was always cold, sometimes with a few pieces of dal mixed in, served on a steel plate that clattered against the concrete when it was set down. No one spoke to me. I could hear footsteps upstairs, muffled voices that might have been arguing, or it might have been a normal conversation. It was impossible to tell through the floorboards. Sometimes I heard cries that could have been my younger cousins. The sound filled my chest with guilt and anger. I did push-ups and jumping jacks to keep warm and sane. I counted them obsessively. 20 push-ups, 50 jumping jacks. Then I would start again. I recited poetry I had memorized for school. I sang songs softly. I practiced ASL signs against the wall where no one could see me. I marked the passage of time by the small rectangle of sunlight that moved across the floor from the window. When it disappeared each night, the darkness felt absolute. On the 4th morning, I heard a car arrive. The sound of the engine was different from that of familiar cars. I then recognized voices I hadn't recognized before. A woman asked for me by name, her tone professional and insistent. My grandfather's voice, soft as honey, said he had the flu and was resting. The woman insisted on seeing me. She said she was my school counselor, Mrs. Brown, and that she had come to get me. My heart leapt with hope and fear simultaneously. I heard an argument. My grandfather's voice rose slightly, losing some of its controlled gentleness. Mrs. Brown's remained firm, using words like mandatory reporting and welfare check. Then, footsteps descending into the basement, quick and furious. My grandfather opened the door and hissed at me to make myself presentable. The sudden light from the stairwell made me squint. He tossed me a clean salwar camis and told me to change quickly. She said that if I tried anything, my cousins would pay the price. Her eyes were as cold as winter stones. I changed with trembling hands, trying to smooth my tangled hair with my fingers. Clean clothes felt strange after days in the same outfit. My grandfather waited outside the door, tapping his foot impatiently. When I came out, he grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks and dragged me upstairs. They took me upstairs. Mrs. Brown was standing in the living room with her arms crossed, her normally warm face now etched with harsh lines. She looked me up and down, taking in my disheveled hair and pale skin, the dark circles under my eyes. He asked if I was okay. I nodded and said I'd been sick, but was feeling better, the lie leaving a bitter taste on my tongue. My grandfather was standing right behind me, his heavy hand on my shoulder, his fingers digging in just enough to remind me of his presence. Mrs. Brown asked why I hadn't answered my phone. My grandfather said gently that he'd been resting without electronic devices on doctor's orders for a bad migraine. She didn't seem convinced. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she studied us both. She asked to speak with me privately. My grandfather said it wasn't appropriate in our culture, that single women didn't meet with strangers alone. She stared at him for a long moment, and I could see her processing this information, filing it away. Then she looked directly at me. She asked if I remembered what we learned last week in ASL class. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. I knew this was my chance. Since my grandfather couldn't see, I assigned help as clearly as possible, my fingers moving in the familiar pattern we practiced. Her expression didn't change, but I could see she realized. I saw her eyes widen slightly before her face regained its composure. She said she hoped I'd be back in class soon and left. The moment his car disappeared down the driveway, my grandfather slapped me. The force of the blow made my head snap to the side, and I tasted blood where my teeth had cut my cheek. I had seen my reflection in the window. He called me a stupid girl and said I just made things worse for everyone. He threw me back down into the basement, pushing me so hard I tripped on the stairs. I heard him making more phone calls, his voice urgent and angry. I couldn't sleep that night. My face hurt where I had been hit, and I kept replaying Mrs. Brown's visit in my mind. Had I understood? Would she come back, or had she just made things worse, like my grandfather said? I pressed my back against the cold wall and tried not to cry. The next day, Mrs. Brown returned. This time she brought a social worker named Janet, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a level-headed demeanor. They said they were doing a welfare check, which was standard procedure when a student was absent for several days. My grandfather had no choice but to let them in, though his smile was strained. He quickly called some of the aunts to make the house seem normal. Within minutes, they began cooking and cleaning as if it were a normal day, filling the air with the scent of spices and the sounds of normalcy. They cleaned me up again, my aunt roughly brushing my hair and pinching my cheeks to give them color. They dressed me in a bright blue Salwar shirt and told me what to say. My aunt whispered that if I didn't cooperate, they'd already chosen husbands for all of us. She showed me photos on her phone, men between 30 and 40 years old, some already married, all from traditional families. They'd send us back in a week. I sat in the living room, trying to appear normal while my insides churned with fear and anger. The social worker asked me questions about school and home. I gave the rehearsed answers while my grandfather watched from his chair, his presence a weight in the room. But I had hidden my ISL notebook in my lap under a cushion. When I shifted position to answer a question about my favorite topics, I dropped it. The pages scattered across the floor, revealing months of sign language practice, notes on how to teach my cousins, drawings of hands forming words. Janet bent down to pick it up and saw pages covered in sign language practice. Slowly, she gathered each page, taking her time to study them. She handed it back to me with a small nod that my grandfather couldn't see. He took pictures of the house, saying it was standard procedure, his camera clicking constantly. He photographed the door locks, the window bars that my grandfather claimed were for security. He mentioned they would return for follow-up visits. My grandfather's jaw tightened, but he smiled and said they were always welcome, that they had nothing to hide. After they left, everything moved quickly. My grandfather called an emergency family meeting. He said the ceremony would take place that night, that they couldn't wait any longer. He called all the families to come immediately. He said the outside world was trying to destroy our traditions, and that we had to act quickly. The men began preparing the main hall, moving furniture and arranging ceremonial objects with little practice. They brought us girls up from our various hiding places. We looked unkempt, with unwashed hair, wrinkled clothes, and sunken eyes that had seen too much. Some of the girls had bruises they tried to hide. They made us bathe and dress in white t-shirts. White for purity, they said. White as ghosts. White as surrender. The fabric felt heavy against my skin. We were lined up by age in the prep room. I was the oldest, so I would go first. I looked at the others. Kavya was still trembling. Maya was defiant but scared. Little Asha was confused and wanted her mother. The room filled with family members as the sun set, casting long shadows across the windows. The men sat in the inner circle on cushions, their faces solemn with the weight of tradition. The silenced women stood against the walls like sentinels, their red threads visible on their wrists, their eyes lowered. On a low table sat silver plates adorned with red thread and scissors. The ceremonial objects gleamed in the lamplight, tools of a tradition that had stolen voices for generations. My stomach churned at the sight. My grandfather began to chant in Sanskrit, his voice deep and rhythmic. The other men joined in, their voices creating a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to vibrate the air. They lit incense that made the air thick and hard to breathe, sandalwood and something else that made me dizzy. The smoke rose to the ceiling like grasping fingers. My father approached, a red thread in his hair. His hands trembled slightly, but his face was like stone. She wouldn't look me in the eyes. I looked at my cousins. Some were crying silently, tears streaming down their cheeks. Others stared straight ahead, already practicing their silence. The youngest sucked her thumb, a habit she had broken years ago. I thought of Anjali, wherever she was now. I thought of all the women lining the walls, decades of silence pressed between them like flowers in a book. I thought of Mrs. Brown and Janet, somewhere in a world where women's voices mattered. I made my decision. When my father caught up with me, I signaled to the other girls. We had practiced this in whispers and gestures when the adults weren't looking. We scattered in all directions. The men weren't expecting it. We had planned escape routes, memorized which windows opened, which doors led where. Some girls ran for the doors, others for the windows. The room erupted in chaos. The white stars flashed like birds taking flight. I ran to the kitchen, where I knew there was a back door. My Uncle Dev caught my cousin near the stairs, his hand closing on her dupatta. She squirmed, dropping the scarf in his hands. 2 girls came out before being caught in the courtyard. I could hear screams and cries all around. My zaris got tangled around my legs, slowing me down. I pulled it up, no longer caring about ownership. I entered the kitchen. The women were there preparing food as they always did during the ceremonies. Pots were bubbling on the stove, and the familiar smell of dough and rice filled the air. They stared up in shock. I begged them to help us, the words just trickling out of my mouth. Most looked away, trained by years of fear, their hands continuing their work automatically. But my Aunt Mira took a step forward. She had always been different, quieter in her rebellion. She blocked the door when my father appeared, breathing heavily from the chase. He ordered her to move. She shook her head, a simple gesture that seemed to shake the foundations of our world. Another aunt joined her, then another. Slowly, the silenced women formed a wall between us and the men. For the first time in decades, they were choosing a side. My father tried to break through, but they closed their arms, their red threads like a chain binding them together. That's when my grandmother appeared. She no longer came to the ceremonies, staying in a room with her memories and photographs of a life before the silence. But she was standing there now, 90 years old and fierce. Her white hair was loose around her shoulders, instead of her usual bun. She still wore her red thread from when she was silenced at 16. The fabric had faded over the decades, but it had never broken. He reached up and removed it from his wrist with arthritic, gnarled fingers. He spoke for the first time in 40 years. His voice was hoarse, but clear, like a door opening on rusty hinges. She told her children to stop. She said she had seen this tradition destroy too many lives. She had seen too many bright girls dimmed. She said she had remained silent when her daughters were silenced, but she wasn't going to watch it happen to her granddaughters. Her words filled the room like water breaking a dam. The room fell completely silent. Even the pots on the stove seemed to quiet their bubbling. My grandfather looked at his mother as if she were a stranger. She walked through the crowd of men who parted before her as if she were parting the sea. Her steps were slow but steady. She took the scissors from the ceremonial plate and cut each red thread into pieces. The sound of the cut seemed incredibly loud. Then she turned to the women lining the walls. She told them they could speak. She said their silence had given men too much power for too long. She said she had spent 40 years regretting her silence. 40 years of words rotting in her throat. One by one, The women began to remove the threads. Some cried as they did it, decades of pent-up emotion bursting forth. Others laughed. The rusty, beautiful sound. My mother took hers off and said my name for the first time in years. The sound of it made me cry. The men didn't know what to do. They were now outnumbered, and more importantly, the moral authority they had claimed was crumbling. Some of the men tried to grab their wives, but the women stood together. My aunt told her husband that, as the weeks passed, the atmosphere changed drastically. That family structure, which had seemed unbreakable, so solid and eternal, began to show its first cracks. Some families couldn't bear it, disintegrating completely. The most ardent defenders of tradition severed ties with those who dared to break the vow of silence. My cousins, formerly bound by this ancient custom, were now placed with relatives while their parents grappled with a new reality. But amidst the dissolution, the support network among the young women grew stronger. Our phones buzzed with messages, sharing support and the reassurance that we weren't alone. We created a secret online group, a refuge where we could speak freely, away from prying eyes. Mrs. Brown, a key figure in this awakening, was instrumental. She guided several young women to report abuse to the authorities, connecting us with therapists and lawyers who understood our cultural complexities but would never accept culture as an excuse for mistreatment. Some cases were successful, others weren't, but the mere threat of legal repercussions was enough to make some men reconsider their actions. The community could no longer hide what was happening. Local news outlets began picking up our stories, with journalists seeking interviews and testimonies. At first, my relationship with my parents was strained. The house felt different, as if the walls themselves were learning to adapt to new sounds. But little by little, my mother began to prepare my favorite dishes, like aloo paratha with extra butter, or the sweet mango kulfi she used to make when I was a child. With a voice that sounded rusty from disuse, she stuttered and asked me about school. Then she shared stories of her own childhood, of the days before silence was imposed upon her, of her longing to be a teacher, and of her love for singing. My father took longer to open up, but finally he asked me to show him what I had learned in ASL. Her fingers, clumsy at first, learned from mine to say sorry. Some of my cousins went to live with relatives who had already abandoned the old ways. Others stayed with parents who were slowly beginning to accept the change. A few were sent back to our homeland, but now they had phones and we kept in touch. We continued teaching each other ASL, not just as a precaution, but because it had become our language of rebellion, our secret freedom. My grandmother became our unexpected champion. She visited the women and spoke openly about her decades of enforced silence. She told the men how much they had missed out on by not listening to their wives' thoughts, the poems she had composed in her mind, the jokes she had wanted to share, the advice she hadn't been able to give. To the women, she reminded them that they were stronger than they imagined. Some listened, others didn't, but she kept talking, retrieving 40 years' worth of words. At the next family gathering, during Diwali, our biggest celebration, everything felt different. Half of the usual people didn't attend, but those who did brought their voices. The women talked and laughed. Their words mingled with the roar of the fireworks. Some still wore the symbolic threads by choice, but now it was a conscious decision. The men seemed, somehow, smaller. They were no longer the only ones with the right to speak. They had to make room for other voices. Angeli was there with her sister, living with more open-minded cousins and attending school. She still had nightmares, but she was healing. She had cut her hair in an act of defiance against tradition and wore jeans instead of traditional clothing. She thanked me for speaking out, and I replied that we did it together. Without each other's support, nothing would have changed. We were each other's voice when we didn't have our own. We continued teaching sign language, but now it was just another way to communicate. Some mothers learned it to talk to their daughters, who were still finding their voices after years of silence. We created signs for feelings that had been buried for too long, signs for the particular frustration of unspoken words, for the joy of free expression, for the fear that still lingered. The language that began as rebellion transformed into healing. Months later, my father apologized. We were sitting in the garden where he taught me to ride a bike, where we planted tomatoes when I was 7. He said he had followed traditions without thinking, simply because that's what his father had done. Seeing my mother find her voice again showed him what he'd been missing. He said he was proud of me for being braver than he'd ever been. He was still struggling with the changes, but he was trying. Not everyone changed. Some families clung to the old ways, moving to communities that still practiced the old customs. They called us corrupt. They said we had lost our culture. Some young women were lost to us, married off quickly before they could rebel. We couldn't save them all. The weight of that failure weighed heavily on my shoulders, but we had cracked the foundations of silence that had stood for generations. And through those cracks, voices were finally being set free. The months after that Diwali were strange. Some families pretended nothing had changed, while others completely fell apart. My cousin Kavya's father tried to arrange a marriage for her, even though she was only 13. He found a 35-year-old man from our homeland who owned a convenience store. He thought that if he moved fast enough, he could marry her off before anyone could stop him. But Kavya had learned more than just sign language from us. She recorded her father on her phone talking about the marriage plans. She sent the recording to our group chat, and we knew we had to act fast. I called Mrs. Brown, and she contacted the authorities. Within 2 days, Kavya was staying with my family while her father dealt with a visit from Child Protective Services. My house became a sort of transitional home for cousins escaping difficult situations. At first, my parents weren't too happy about it, but my mother kept saying she wished someone had helped her at that age. We even had 3 girls living with us at the same time. My father converted the basement, which had been a storage room, into a bedroom. The same basement where I'd been locked up at my grandfather's house. This one had light-colored walls, windows, and no locks on the doors. One night, my Uncle Dev showed up at our door demanding we give him back his daughter. He was drunk and furious, banging on the door so hard the windows rattled. My father, for the first time, stood up to him. He told Dev to leave or he'd call the police. They shoved each other in the front yard. Neighbors came out to watch. Someone called the police, and Dev spent the night in jail. After that, things escalated. The traditional wing of the family began to organize. They were holding meetings at my grandfather's house to figure out how to regain control. Someone leaked their plans to us. They were going to take all the girls out of school and send them back immediately. They had already bought plane tickets for some of them. We had to move quickly. Mrs. Brown helped us contact a lawyer who specializes in custody cases. Some of the girls were able to file protection orders. Others had to hide with supportive relatives. It was like a strange underground train for teenagers trying to avoid forced marriages. The community was completely divided. At the supermarket, families literally crossed into different aisles to avoid each other. The temple had to hold 2 separate services because people refused to pray together. Some of my uncles tried to open their own temple where the old rules still applied, but they couldn't find enough people to fund it. My grandfather attempted one last power move. He called a meeting of all the male elders from the neighboring states. They were going to vote on whether to officially banish the families who had abandoned the tradition of silence. She thought that if enough communities joined together, they could pressure everyone to return to the line. But my grandmother had her own plans. She had been busy those months talking to women from other communities. She organized a counter-rally that same day. Women who had been silenced for decades came from hundreds of miles away. They filled a community center we had rented, with their red threads left at home. The men's meeting had maybe 30 people. The women's meeting had more than 200. My grandmother stood up and told her story again, but this time she named names. She spoke of the old man who had beaten his wife for humming while he cooked. She spoke of the girl who had spoken out rather than be silenced. It had dates and details that made the men's claims of tradition sound like what they really were: control and abuse. Some women from the other communities returned home and removed their threads that same day. Their husbands called my grandfather furious, saying that his family had infected theirs with rebellion. The support network grew beyond our family. We started receiving messages from girls in other states asking how to learn sign language, how to resist. My father lost his job because his boss was one of those traditionalist types, but my mother got a job for the first time in 20 years. She worked in a nursery, finally getting to teach like she'd always wanted. Her voice grew stronger every day. Now she sang while she cooked. Badly, but happily. The next crisis came when Uncle Raj tried to kidnap his daughter from school. He showed up with 2 other men and tried to force her into a van. But the school was prepared. We had warned them about possible attempts. They immediately closed the school and called the police. He was arrested in the parking lot while his daughter watched from a classroom window. That's when things got really bad. Traditionalist families began threatening anyone who helped us. They slashed our tires. Someone threw a brick through our window. My father installed security cameras, and my mother learned to use pepper spray. We traveled as a group and communicated constantly, but we weren't going to back down. The girls who had been forced into marriages began to ask for help. Some were able to get divorced or have their marriages annulled. Others were trapped, but at least they could talk to us, know they weren't alone. We raised money to help some of them start over. My cousin Maya became our spokesperson. She was 16 now and fierce. She started a YouTube channel talking about our experiences. The videos went viral in our community and beyond. She received death threats, but also messages from girls all over the world dealing with similar traditions. The turning point came on my cousin Nija's 16th birthday. Her parents were traditionalists, but they hesitated. They had planned a small ceremony, not complete silencing, but a symbolic use of the thread. Nija played along until the crucial moment arrived. Then she stood up and gave a speech she had been practicing for weeks. She spoke of wanting to be a doctor, of having dreams that needed a voice. She spoke of loving her parents, but not their traditions. He untied the string they had just wrapped around him and handed it back. His mother began to cry and then untied her own string. His father stood there, stunned, as his wife spoke his name for the first time in 20 years. That became the pattern. The girls would pretend to play along until the crucial moment and then refuse. Some families accepted it, others exploded, but each refusal made the next one easier. The tradition was dying, one birthday at a time. My grandfather's health began to fail. I think the loss of control broke something in him. He suffered a heart attack and spent weeks in the hospital. My grandmother sat by his bedside and talked to him constantly, making up for all those years of silence. I don't know if he heard her, but she needed to talk. When he left, he was different, smaller in some ways. He stopped calling meetings. He stopped trying to control everyone. He spent his days sitting in his garden, watching the world change without him. Sometimes I felt sorry for him, but then I remembered the basement and the fear in my cousin's eyes. The following Diwali, we celebrated 2 holidays, one for the traditional families and one for the rest of us. Ours was louder, filled with women's voices and laughter. We could hear the other celebration across town, quiet and subdued. Some families sent members to both, trying to keep a foot in both worlds. Anjali was accepted into university. She was studying law, wanting to help other girls in our situation. She still had scars, both physical and mental, but she was building a life. Her younger sister lived with her, saved from the marriage their father had arranged. My parents renewed their vows on their anniversary. This time, my mother spoke her own promises instead of remaining silent. He promised never to be silent again, to teach his daughters to use their voices. My father promised to listen, to value their words. He wasn't perfect, but he was honest. Sign language classes continued, but now they were just for fun and communication. We taught parents and siblings, creating a truly inclusive language. Some of the older women struggled with arthritis while signing, but they persevered. They had waited too long to communicate freely. Mrs. Brown received a state award for her intervention. She took all the girls to the ceremony. We all waved thanks in unison, a sea of hands moving together. She cried and said that we had taught her more than she had taught us. Some families moved away, unable to accept the changes. They found communities that still practiced the old ways, places where their daughters' voices would be stolen at 16. We couldn't save those girls, but we could be ready if they ever asked for help. My grandmother passed away that spring. At her funeral, hundreds of women spoke about how she had inspired them. They shared stories of their first words after their silence, of the courage she had given them. Even some men spoke up, admitting they had been wrong. My grandfather sat in the front row, looking lost without his voice filling his days. By the time I graduated high school, the tradition of silence was mostly extinct in our community. Some families held symbolic ceremonies with temporary threads, lasting a day or a week. Others abandoned them altogether. A few clung to the old customs, but they were becoming increasingly isolated. I entered university on a scholarship, planning to study social work. I wanted to help other girls trapped by traditions that hurt them. My parents were proud, although my father still sometimes seemed surprised when I spoke my mind at dinner. The network we built became a formal organization. We obtained nonprofit status and funding to help girls escape forced marriages and abuse. We conducted workshops teaching sign language and self-defense. Some of the women who had been silenced the longest became our most ardent advocates. At my last family gathering before college, I counted voices instead of silence. 23 women talking, laughing, arguing, singing. My youngest cousin performed a dance to a song she had written herself. My aunts debated politics while cooking. My mother told embarrassing stories from my childhood. The men had mostly adapted. They helped with the cooking and cleaning, tasks they had previously considered beneath them. They listened when their wives and daughters spoke. Some still seemed uncomfortable, but they were trying. The change was slow, but it was happening. I still sign sometimes, when words aren't enough. The language that saved us became a part of us. We teach it to every new girl in the family, just in case. But now it's a choice, not a desperate necessity. Our voices are free, and we will never allow them to be silenced again. Looking at my red string bracelet one last time before leaving for college, I cut it off and threw it away. I didn't need the reminder anymore. None of us did. We had found our voices, and nothing would take them away from us.